har ut på tur. Längst hur bra som helst. Vet ni? Men det är jobbigt. Det är hur bra träning som helst, vet ni. Ja. Oh, I forgot. You do not speak the Swedish language so well. So, but längdskidor, that's long cross country, that's long skis. The most worst thing was when I saw a moose. Very angry moose. You do not want to mess with the moose. When you are, it's called älg. Älg in Swedish. Now I should go to they want me to teach a TOK lesson. So I will do that. But first I must have some blåbärssoppa. Blåbärssoppa. I don't know what it's called in English. Good. Good for skiing. Oy. You don't know how hard it is to navigate these long skis. Wow. Good jul, by the way. Turn off the silly music. Hello. How are you guys doing? Oh, I don't need these. My props. They got off. So you can see my eyes. The eyes are the window to the soul. Uh-oh, now my hat looks silly. Oh, yeah. Anyway, guys, so welcome to another lesson at TOK. This is going to be the third and final lesson of our history review. I'm going to cover two different things on here. And we'll just kind of get going right away on that. And I will unfreeze that. Wow. Oops, push the wrong button. Darn it. Sorry. Yeah, that's working. Anyway, okay, guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about faith in history. Once again, make that thing go away. That thing's obnoxious. No, it did go away. All right. We're going to talk about faith in history. And it's actually really one of the more important things. Now remember, I'm emphasizing this concept a little bit more than I normally would. I got this sweater in the Norwegian fjords, by the way. If you ever have a chance to go to the fjords, go to the fjords. Absolutely fantastically beautiful. Anyway, we're going to talk about faith in history, and I'm emphasizing faith in history a little more than normal than I otherwise would, because of the simple fact that it's one of the questions. It's not really about faith; it's about trust. But whatever, it works. It's pretty much the same idea. So let's take a look. To what extent do we use faith in history to create our knowledge? Well, it's going to be to a very, very large extent. You can almost say anything that you believe in history is going to have to be based at some level on an element of faith. Okay? And I think that you can argue that pretty convincingly. Anyway, so knowledge in history is a unique type of knowledge, and I've talked about this, but once again, it's a review. So we gain knowledge even though no one has actually experienced the events and the eras that we claim to know so much about. In all other areas of knowledge, here, I'll just put this up there. Oops. So, in all the other areas of knowledge, we have some sort of a minds-on experience. Talked about this even yesterday. Well, it's not yesterday in the video world, but whatever, it was yesterday in real life. Talked about this yesterday. There's no hands-on or minds-on experience for history. Everything has to be kind of recreated in our minds, and it's kind of this sort of, abstract idea which kind of exists in just a imaginary center of your brain. I mean, and if you think of the difference between, this is kind of an interesting idea, if you think of the difference between something like myth and fantasy and reality, in your mind, what's the difference? Well, one of them we say that we have evidence for, but seriously, in your mind, what's the actual difference between a fantastical story like King Richard, not King Richard, what am I saying, King Arthur, and all that stuff, and another story like the real story of the Middle Ages? So what's the difference? Well, I mean, in our minds, they're kind of the same. They're both based on this sort of imaginative, recreated image in our heads. And so that's funny about this, because everything else, ethics, you can know it. I mean, and all this other kind of stuff. I've talked about it before, but there's no way to be 100% sure that the beliefs we have about historical events are completely correct. There's just no way to be sure. Okay, there just isn't. But I mean, we can be convinced enough that we put that into what we call our knowledge. I mean, that's a different thing altogether. But anyway, so much historical knowledge comes from putting faith in the claims. The word faith should not be defined as meaning religious conviction. It has nothing to do with religious conviction in this sense. And once again, you can kind of use it as a synonym with trust. They're not exactly the same, but they're close enough. And here's the definition. I'll put it up there. I've put it up in another video before. But a particularly unshakable form of belief. Particularly unshakable form of belief. It's like you can't shake this belief. Based upon ideas, teachings, and reported historical events, which to the individual seems conclusive. It seems conclusive. The stories we know about, the Revolutionary War, or, the sort of, whatever, French Revolution, all these sorts of things. The stories that we know about this stuff seem conclusive. And it's funny because, we have no way to actually experience it. So, you have to use faith. You have to be able to do this. And I would say that if you're going to talk about the area of knowledge history in that question, and once again, that's a question that, I've said this before to you guys, but that's a question that I kind of started, and what I was thinking about when I was doing it. Doesn't mean you have to do this, but the areas of knowledge I was thinking about of what this would apply to really well was history. And so it applies very, very well in there. It really does. Because you're always going to have this element of trust in history. You're just always going to have to. I don't think anything that I haven't experienced, which is most everything of history, I don't think that there's anything that I can know without saying I put some faith into it or trust into it. So faith in historical knowledge claims, when we consider history, how do we come up with our knowledge? If we can only rely on what other people have told us, this is the premise or the idea, or base our conclusions on documents other people have written, then what else is there except faith for claiming knowledge in history? What else is there? Now we can go find some artifacts, but remember, once again, as I recently said in the other videos, that all artifacts are silent. All documents are silent. They're silent. They don't tell you the story. You have to interpret that onto them. And to be honest, we don't have the opportunity to go around the world and search all these things and do all this stuff. We have to put our claims, especially as consumers of knowledge. We have to do that. So 3 types of faith. There might be more, but everything comes in threes. That's aliens in threes. If it comes in threes ever, it has to do with aliens. It's truth. Faith in the authenticity of the claims made by past documents and artifacts. Faith, I'm going to talk about each of these in the upcoming slides. Faith in our own and previous interpretations of events and documents, and faith in the authority of the history books and the ones making the historical knowledge claims. So let's go on. Okay? Faith in the authenticity. Historians put faith in the authenticity of the documents they record or read to make the knowledge claims. Right? They do. We do. You kind of have to, as a historian, believe. You can be critical of it, but you kind of have to just make that leap of faith and say this is actually written by the person that says it's written by. I don't think you have any other way of going back and seeing if it's faked or not. You can do a test on the paper and so on and so forth, but you're going to have to, as a historian, at some level, put some faith in the claims being made. If you go around doubting every single solitary document's authenticity, if you go around doubting every claim made by every person throughout history, well, you're not going to get very far. It's just denialism. And the history book would be no pages long. It would just be one thing in the front that said, well, nothing happened we're sure of, so let's just skip this subject altogether. And so, if we're not going to do that, then at some level we have to have faith. Often there are only singular sources from which information is taken. I'll give you a good example, and that's why I have Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall. If you do know what Hadrian's Wall is, well, good thing you're learning, because I'm going to tell you. Okay? Hadrian's Wall still exists today. It's in Scotland. Now, the Romans. You can imagine that, right? I'll see if I can find a good gift for that. Probably. Anyway, so the Romans are marching along. They're leaving Rome, we're leaving Rome, we're going to take over Britain. And they go and they take over Britain, and then they come along to Britain, and here's what the Romans did. This is actually what they did. The Romans would go along, and they would come into a town, and they say, you are now part of the Roman Empire. And they would go, kind of like that. That's where Hitler got his nifty idea, thought the Romans were cooler. Cool. But anyway, and then the people of England in these villages and towns and shires, it's England's shire, like Bilbo Baggins. But anyway, so they would say, no, we don't want to be part of the stupid Roman Empire. And then the Roman Empire said, you have two choices. One, we will kill you all and stick your heads on poles to make you an example for other stupid people. And people in the Shire are like, well, that doesn't really seem like it. Well, what's option two? What's option two? And option two was, you would be part of the Roman Empire. You would be a citizen in the Roman Empire. And very often what they did is the people who were already in charge of the Shire got to be in charge of the Roman Empire, but then they would just have to send resources to the Roman Empire and pledge their allegiance to the Roman Empire. And the Romans would build roads, and they'd build aqueducts, and they did a whole bunch of actually really kind of stuff. They built schools, and they brought wine, and they brought baths, like Bath. There's still a town in England called Bath. And they have Roman baths there. So the Romans did their thing, and they marched on up to Scotland, and they said, hey, you barbarians, you're now part of the Roman Empire. And the Scots said, oi! And the Romans said, okay, we're going to kill you. And the Scots said, oi! We paint ourselves blue and we're going to chop your legs off with one fell swoop. If you ever watched Braveheart, so dumb. That's about Scots and the Romans. But anyway, so the Romans fought, and there's so much space up there in Scotland, and there's so few people. Eventually the Romans said, you know what, this is just sucking our resources and this is just stupid, let's just build a wall. And that side of the wall is Barbarianville, and this side of the wall is civilization. And if the Scots stayed on that side of the wall, it was okay. It was kind of just like a treat. It was kind of like a truce, not even a truce, but they left the Scots alone, and they couldn't. That was the end of the Roman Empire. Okay? That was the end of the Roman Empire. It was the end. The Roman Empire did not extend north in the British Isles further than Hadrian's Wall. And it never did. And the Roman Empire finally collapsed, and the wall left, and the walls remained. And it's kind of ruins like that. But anyway, so that's what it is. Now, the Scots were not a literate society. They did not have writing. So everything that we know about the Scots, about the people, the Celts, they weren't Scots at the time, it wasn't Scotland, they were Celts. And everything we know about the people at the time was from the Roman Empire. Everything. So we have these ideas that they're barbarians. The Romans said they ate their own children, and they painted themselves blue. They used this type of battle strategies, and yada, 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 yada. The Celts never recorded any of this. And so this is the idea. And so we only have one source from which it's taken. So of course you can say as a historian you have to take it with a grain of salt, but to believe anything at all, to believe that it's not all made up, you have to have some faith in the authenticity of the documents. And that's kind of what I'm talking about there. And even if there are corroborating documents, which there isn't in this case, but sometimes there are, they make the assumption more feasible. It's impossible to be completely sure, so you have to have the element of faith. Okay? Now these are the kind of things that if you were going to do this question, and you were going to do history, then you can talk about these things specifically, like the element of trust that is needed. Okay? Faith is simply a necessary element. Okay? Faith in one's own interpretations. Okay? That I'm interpreting things correctly. The historian needs to have faith in her hypothesis when doing the research. When making claims and presenting work to the peers, the historian must have faith that the work she has done is reflective of reality. However, even the greatest level of conviction does not make one's claims true. All right. But faith also brings with it the risk of fooling oneself into, you can convince yourself. You have a hypothesis. You're trying to support it. you find this is a support, this is a support, this is a support. Look, I've made my hypothesis. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but I mean, you're convinced and you have faith in what you're seeing, and you believe it because it kind of supports it. But I mean, there's so many, issues and situations in history that are debated by equally intelligent and equally educated historians that disagree. And so, I mean, what's going on there? It's like, it's a very funny thing. Okay, and then finally, especially for us as consumers of history, I've talked about this one a long time, so I'll just briefly kind of go over this. We put faith in the claims made by historians and history books. We do. Historians and history books are powerful authorities in our mind. They are. And there's no practical way for us to double check. We just can't double check. There's no way for us to double check this at all. All right. And so that's the end of that one, the one on faith. I'm going to do this one. It's a fairly short one. It's going to be on authority and consensus. And I had you guys read a thing last year where you read some excerpts from 1984, which I think you guys are going to be reading. I think you guys are going to be reading that in your senior year. If you're not, you need to read it anyway. It's really one of the greatest books of all time. That's a true fact. That's not a biased opinion in any way, shape, or form. I used that tally thing, what made it great, and there it comes. I'm making that up. But yes, it's an excellent, excellent, excellent book. It's one that's always relevant. Yeah. All right, anyway, authority and consensus, okay? This is from 1984. I'll put it up there. Who controls the past? Ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present? Controls the past. The narrative of the past. Now remember, your identity is tied to the history you know. Who you are as an American, who you are as any other nationality. What your family story is. What your identity is tied to that. And the narrative of the past is powerful in creating people's identity and ideas of nationhood and ideas of patriotism and ideas of belongingness and ideas of all kinds of stuff. It's very, very inextricably tied up who we are. And the people in charge now, I mean, you cannot argue with that quote. The people in charge now have the ability to alter the past. You see it happening all the time. Remember, the past is gone. It's not there. What happened, happened, and it will have happened, and it will always have happened. But we're not privy to what happened. We're privy to the account of what happened. And the account is malleable, changeable, alterable, fluid. And that is, what you mean, what this is about authority. Authority is incredibly important for creating the historical narrative. So knowledge in history is malleable, and authority has the means to shape historical knowledge in any way it seems fit. That seems fit. What reasons are there for learning the history we do learn and not any other? Have you ever thought about that? Now, what is history? History is the history of everything that has happened through the civilization of humanity. Everything. Every person. Right? That's history. So why is certain history more important than other history, and who makes that determination? Here's kind of a joke in history. And it's only a joke. It's only a joke because it was actually pretty much real for the longest time. I mean, when I went to grade school and high school, we learned absolutely nothing about the Native Americans. I mean, I went to school in Oregon. We're in Native America. Well, the entire nation is Native American area. But the Northwest Indians live in this area, and so I learned nothing about them. Nothing at all. I never learned anything about the Japanese internment camps. I learned about Japanese internment camps from a guy named Mr. Sakawi when I picked strawberries in the summer to make summer money. He was Japanese, and he was in an internment camp. And he told me about the internment camps. I was like, what? What? We did that to people? It's completely gone. So why did the government choose to not include that? And you guys learn about that now. Why do you learn about that now? Why is that important? And what are they removing to put that in? And so this is the idea, and it's absolutely fascinating if you think about it. And to say that there's no rhyme or reason that people just throw stuff in. No. We have a lot of reasons to throw stuff in. Why do we learn so much more about, for instance, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement now? Well, because it's very important. Why do we learn about gay rights now and LGBTQ community rights now? And why is that important now? Well, we've determined that to be important. It isn't necessarily more or less important than anything else we've had in the past. It's just that's what we are determining now to be important. I mean, there's reasons that it's important because it's relevant, and we're living in a society that's changing, and we need to understand and catalog that change. I'm not even arguing against the inclusion of that kind of stuff, but it's just an interesting sort of like decision at a political level. In many countries around, I forgot to tell you the joke I was going to tell you. It used to be, the joke is this: for 10,000 years, Native Americans lived in the Pacific Northwest. And then came Lewis and Clark, so let's start there. And it's not, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it's not really too far away from the truth of how things were traditionally. So in many countries around the world, the portrayal of history is a highly political and very sensitive issue. It is indeed a highly political and very sensitive issue. In China, very sensitive issue. North Korea, no doubt. I don't know what they teach, but I'm sure it probably is, but whatever. Maybe that's just because I believe the American propaganda. Certainly is in Turkey. It certainly is in, for instance, places like Estonia, Latvia, the Baltic states up there, with their sort of relationships with Russia in World War II. Certainly is with Germany. It's highly sensitive. It's here too. And the whole sort of argument about emancipation or not emancipation for the reason for the Civil War. It's very sensitive issues for people. I mean, we see right now the kind of rewriting or reinterpreting of history with all the riots or protests, whatever you want to call them, all that stuff. I think they're both protests and riots. But anyway, that's sort of, I mean, there's valid arguments for protesters saying, hey, why are we honoring these people who perpetuated slavery? There are valid arguments there. And I'm not supporting that they take them out or whatever. That's somebody else can decide that. But that's, those are valid, sensitive issues about the interpretation of history. Consensus. So authority is very, very important in this. Very important. And then also, consensus. Consensus is knowledge by agreement. We agree. And this is kind of how history makes its knowledge. It's through consensus. I mean, obviously you can't, if we all agree that aliens brought the pyramids here and we didn't have any evidence, well, okay, that's not going to mean that it's true. But what happens is historians have a certain amount of information, they look at it, they come to interpretations, and kind of like peer review, well, that's not kind of like peer review, it is peer review. Kind of like what I meant was it's kind of like a proof in math where knowledgeable people have to agree the logical steps are sound. Same sort of idea, although you can't have the same level of logic obviously in psychology or in history because there's no real premises per se. I mean, there's some, but whatever. They're not the same as math. But so that's the idea. And then you come to an agreement. That's an agreed upon interpretation through consensus. Then that gets put into the history books. Yeah. And then that gets taught. That interpretations of things get taught. And that becomes what is real and what is true. And if a claim is to be considered knowledge, it must be accepted by a greater community of historians. The information in the history books is fact because enough people believe that interpretations made are good interpretations. So when enough people agree this is a good interpretation, it becomes fact. And the fact is taught to students in an unquestioningly manner. When you're little, they don't teach you like, oh, this might have happened. No, they teach you this is the thing. Do a test. What happened? This happened. Yes, you're correct. Thank you. So, and then in that sense, you kind of internalize that knowledge as being real because they've told you it was real, you repeated it was real, they confirmed your repetition was good repetition, and so subsequently it gets installed in your memory, in your mind as real. Whereas, if you come from another country, you hear another story altogether, another truth altogether. In the other videos I talked about, for instance, the different perceptions of the war, the American war to save the nation or something like that, or the American War, which they say in Vietnam, the war against the Americans to save the nation. That's I think it's what it's called. And then here we just call it the Vietnam War. I mean, that's a different thing altogether. And anyway, however, just because a large group of people agree upon an interpretation doesn't mean the interpretation is correct. Just because we want to call it the Vietnam War and we say that we're helping the South Vietnamese and so on, so it doesn't necessarily mean that's correct. It doesn't mean it's not. It just means that we have different interpretation. And the Vietnamese currently in Vietnam now would probably, at least the Communist Party would say, no, this was a war of American aggression. You invaded our country and tried to overthrow the government. And so there we have it. And they teach their kids that, and their kids grow up learning that. Doesn't mean they hate Americans or that, we hate communists and Vietnamese. It just means we have different versions of history, which we agree on are truth. And this has to do a lot about the consensus of things. So if you need examples for your TOK paper, the whole story about the Vietnam War, or the War of American Aggression, whatever you want to call it, that whole story, it's a very, very interesting and telling example for things. And yeah, anyway, so, and most of the anyway, whatever. So, nevertheless, I think that's the end of that one. And nu ska jag ut och åka skidor igen. Jag har stått här tillräckligt länge. Ja, heja Sverige förresten. Heja Sverige. Och god jul. Men first, we will have a little music. Then we have some music to go. Oh, I'll play this. So, I don't think guys will put these on yet until I get back out to the track. Hello, part of the bra.